November 13th, 1942. Iron Bottom Sound, off Guadalcanal, 0300 hours. 13. American warships are sliding through absolute darkness. No moon, no stars. A tropical overcast has swallowed the sky. The only light comes from the faint luminescence of disturbed seawater, curling away from steel hulls, moving at 20 knots. Somewhere ahead, a Japanese force is coming. How many ships? Nobody knows for certain. Where exactly? Nobody can say. The radar operators are tracking blips on their screens, counting contacts, measuring closing speeds. They know the enemy is there. They know the bearing. They know the range. But the admirals on the bridge are not looking at radar screens. They are staring into blackness, waiting for something they can see with their own eyes. This is doctrine. This is regulation. This is how the United States Navy has fought for 150 years. You do not open fire until you have visual confirmation. You do not trust a green dot on a cathode ray tube. You trust your rangefinders, those massive binocular instruments mounted high on the superstructure. You trust your lookouts, trained men with exceptional night vision stationed at every corner of the ship. You trust the Mark I eyeball, the instrument that has guided naval gunnery since before the ironclads. Radar is for early warning. Radar is for general awareness. Radar is a tool for search, not for targeting. The regulations say so. The admirals believe it. The gunnery manuals confirm it. And tonight, that doctrine is about to get nearly 1,000 American sailors killed. But on one ship, something different is happening. Something unauthorized. Something that the Bureau of Ordnance has explicitly forbidden, that senior surface warfare officers have dismissed as reckless experimentation, that violates decades of gunnery tradition and training. A young officer has run a cable. Not through official channels, not with permission, not according to any approved technical manual. He has simply taken the radar output, the range and bearing data flowing from the SG surface search set, and connected it directly to the ship's Mark 37 fire control computer. The computer does not care where the data comes from. It only needs numbers. Range, bearing, rate of change. The guns do not care either. They only need a solution. What happens next will change naval warfare forever. But first, every assumption about fighting at night has to burn. To understand why that cable mattered, you have to understand what American sailors were facing in the waters around Guadalcanal in the fall of 1942. The Japanese owned the night. It was not a metaphor. It was not propaganda. It was a terrifying operational reality that had cost the United States Navy more tonnage in 3 months than Pearl Harbor. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, night combat was not a contingency. It was a core competency. They had spent 20 years preparing for it. Ever since the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had limited their fleet size relative to the Americans and British. Japanese strategists understood they would never match American industrial capacity. They could not build more ships, so they decided to build better night fighters. Their lookouts were selected for exceptional night vision, men who could spot a destroyer's silhouette at ranges where American officers saw only blackness. They trained with special diets, controlled light exposure, systematic conditioning of the eyes. Their torpedoes were superior. The Type 93, which the Americans would come to call the Long Lance, was a 24-inch oxygen-fueled weapon with a range of over 20 miles and a warhead of over 1,000 pounds. It ran nearly without wake. It was virtually undetectable until it hit. Their tactics were built around ambush, surprise, and overwhelming force at close range. Japanese cruisers practiced launching coordinated torpedo salvos at night, withdrawing before the enemy could respond. And it worked. By the time American forces arrived at Guadalcanal in August 1942, Japanese naval doctrine for night combat was the most sophisticated in the world. The Americans had radar. But radar, in those desperate months, was a machine almost nobody trusted. Savo Island, August 9, 1942. The first major surface action of the Guadalcanal campaign. A Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa approached the American anchorage after dark. 8 ships, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 1 destroyer. The Americans had the advantage. They had radar-equipped ships screening the transports. They had patrol aircraft searching the approaches. They had numerical superiority in the immediate area. They also had warnings. An Australian coast watcher had spotted Mikawa's force that afternoon. A search aircraft from the tender Curtis had seen them. The reports came in through multiple channels. Someone should have acted. No one did. The American commanders, Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley of the Royal Australian Navy and Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, were distracted, confused about the reports, uncertain whether the Japanese force was heading toward them or away. Crutchley had departed the screening area to attend a conference with General Vandegrift on Guadalcanal. He took his flagship, the cruiser HMAS Australia, with him. The American screen was split into 3 groups, 1 north of Savo Island, 1 south, 1 to the east, near the transports. No unified command, no coordination between groups, no clear plan for what to do if the Japanese appeared. At 0136, Mikawa's force slipped between the northern and southern groups. The American radar detected them. The operators saw the blips. They reported contacts. The information went up the chain and stopped. The officers on watch did not know what to make of it. False contacts were common. The radar was new. The operators were inexperienced. Maybe it was interference. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe the contacts were friendly ships out of position. 38 minutes after the first radar contact, the Japanese launched torpedoes and turned on searchlights. What followed was slaughter. The heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra took 2 torpedo hits and multiple shell strikes in the first minutes. She was left burning, drifting, and would later be scuttled. The heavy cruiser USS Chicago was hit by a torpedo that blew off part of her bow. Her captain, paralyzed by confusion, took her out of the fight without warning the other ships. The northern group, the cruisers Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, learned they were under attack when Japanese shells began exploding on their decks. Vincennes took over 70 hits. Her captain was killed on the bridge. She sank at 0:50. Quincy was struck by torpedoes and gunfire simultaneously. A Japanese searchlight illuminated her bridge just before a shell killed nearly everyone there. She went down at 0:35. Astoria fought back. Her gunners managed to hit the Japanese cruiser Chokai, but Astoria was burning from multiple hits. Her damage control teams overwhelmed. She sank the following afternoon. In less than an hour, the Japanese had sunk 4 Allied heavy cruisers and damaged a 5th. Their losses: 58 dead, a handful of shell hits, minor damage to 1 cruiser. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died that night. The radar had seen them coming. The radar had provided warning. The warning had dissolved somewhere between the operator's console and the decisions of men who did not understand what they were seeing. The pattern was unmistakable. At Savo, the Americans had radar. They lost 4 cruisers. At Cape Esperance on October 11th, the Americans tried again. This time, Rear Admiral Norman Scott commanded a force of cruisers and destroyers specifically tasked with intercepting the Tokyo Express. Scott had radar. He had a plan. He even achieved surprise. His force crossed the T on the Japanese column, the classic maneuver of naval warfare. But the execution was chaos. Scott's radar operators detected the Japanese. They reported contacts. Scott hesitated. He was not certain whether the blips were enemy ships or his own destroyers, which had gotten out of position. He ordered a ceasefire just as his guns found the range. The Japanese had time to recover. They launched torpedoes. The American destroyer Duncan was hit by friendly fire. The cruiser Boise took a shell in her ammunition magazine that nearly sank her. The Americans won. They sank a cruiser and a destroyer. But it was a confused, ugly victory that proved nothing about systematic superiority. The Japanese came back. The Tokyo Express kept running. Henderson Field kept taking shells. And American commanders kept looking at radar screens with skepticism and doubt. The technology itself was revolutionary, perhaps the most important military innovation since the internal combustion engine. Radio detection and ranging, radar, worked on a principle that physicists had understood for decades. Transmit a pulse of radio energy. Wait for it to bounce off a solid object. Measure the time delay. Calculate the range. Simple in theory, extraordinarily difficult in practice. The engineering challenges were immense. You needed transmitters powerful enough to send pulses over long distances. You needed receivers sensitive enough to detect the faint echoes returning. You needed antennas that could scan the horizon rapidly. You needed displays that could convert the raw data into something a human operator could interpret. By 1942, American engineers had solved most of these problems. The SG Surface Search Radar, scheduled for fleet-wide installation, was a masterpiece of wartime engineering. It operated on a wavelength of 10 centimeters, short enough to provide precise bearing data, long enough to cut through tropical rain and sea spray. Its antenna rotated continuously. sweeping the horizon every few seconds. Its plan position indicator, the PPI display, showed contacts as bright dots on a circular screen, with the ship at the center and range rings marking distance. A destroyer-sized target could be detected at over 15 miles, a cruiser at 20, a battleship even further. 15 miles, in total blackness, through rain, through fog, through the smoke of burning ships. On paper, this should have made night fighting trivial. The Americans could detect the enemy at ranges where no human eye could function. They could track closing speeds. They could count individual ships in a formation. They could, theoretically, aim and fire before the Japanese even knew they were there. But that is not what happened. Because between the radar screen and the guns stood a wall of doctrine, bureaucracy, institutional suspicion, and distrust of anything that had not been proven in the fleet for 20 years. The problem was not hardware. The problem was human. Senior officers had spent their entire careers learning one system of naval gunnery. It was elegant. It was proven. It had worked at Jutland and in every fleet exercise since. That system depended on optical rangefinders. These were massive binocular instruments, some over 30 feet long, mounted high on the superstructure where they had the best view of the horizon. They worked by triangulation. A trained operator looked through two eyepieces spaced far apart, brought the images into alignment, and read the range off a calibrated scale. The best rangefinder crews could determine distance to a target with an accuracy of a few dozen yards at 10 miles. But they needed to see the target. In daylight, against a clearly visible enemy, optical rangefinding was superb. American naval gunnery was among the best in the world. At the Battle of Surigao Strait, when conditions were right, American battleships would hit moving targets at ranges over 20,000 yards. At night, the system failed. You cannot triangulate what you cannot see. So, naval doctrine had developed workarounds, searchlights, star shells, illumination rounds, methods of bringing artificial light to the battlefield so the human eye and the optical rangefinder could do their work. These methods were dangerous. A searchlight gave away your position as surely as it revealed the enemy. Star shells took time to deploy and could illuminate your own ships as easily as the enemy's. Night combat was inherently chaotic, and every doctrine for fighting in darkness recognized this. The solution was to avoid night battle when possible. When night battle was unavoidable, you closed to short range, concentrated your fire, and accepted the losses. Radar offered another way. But radar gave you a dot. A green smear on a glowing screen, flickering with interference, drifting slightly with each antenna rotation. It told you range and bearing. It told you the contact was there. It did not tell you what the contact was. It did not tell you whether that blip was an enemy cruiser or a friendly destroyer that had drifted out of formation. It did not tell you whether you were looking at one ship or two ships close together. It did not give you the certainty that a trained rangefinder crew could provide. And it was new. The men who understood radar were young. Technicians, scientists, junior officers who had trained on the equipment during its development. The men who controlled the guns were old, captains and admirals who had spent 20 years perfecting a system that did not include cathode ray tubes. The old men did not trust what they could not see. E. The regulations were explicit. Radar information could be used for search, for early warning, for general awareness. But fire control, the process of aiming guns and calculating firing solutions, was to remain in the hands of optical systems. The Mark 37 Fire Control Director, the mechanical brain at the heart of American naval gunnery, was designed to receive data from rangefinders, not radar. There were technical reasons, there were institutional reasons, there were reasons that made perfect sense inside the Pentagon and the Bureau of Ordnance and the pre-war Naval War College. But in the waters off Guadalcanal in November 1942, those reasons were killing people. Because the Japanese knew what the Americans had, and they had figured out how to beat it. They attacked on the darkest nights. They used flashless powder. They closed to knife-fighting range before the Americans could react. They launched torpedo spreads from beyond visual range, then turned and ran before the first explosion lit the sky. The radar screen showed them coming. The radar screen showed exactly where they were. And the American gunners stood at their stations, waiting for orders to fire, waiting for someone on the bridge to look through binoculars and say, "I see them." By the time visual contact came, the long lances were already in the water. Robert Page was not a sailor. He was a physicist, a man more comfortable with oscilloscopes than ocean swells. In 1934, Page had joined the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington as a young scientist working on radio propagation. He was 21 years old, fresh from a doctorate in physics, fascinated by the behavior of electromagnetic waves. The Navy was interested in radio for communication, for sending messages across vast distances, for coordinating fleets that might be spread across thousands of miles of ocean. What they were not interested in was using radio as a detector. But Page had read about experiments in Britain and Germany. Scientists there had noticed something peculiar. When radio waves struck solid objects, some of the energy bounced back. If you could measure that echo, you could determine where the object was. The principle was simple. The engineering was formidable. Page began building. He scrounged equipment from other projects. He worked late nights, burning through vacuum tubes and capacitors. By 1936, he had constructed a prototype system that could detect aircraft at a distance of 25 miles. He demonstrated it for the admirals. They were polite. They were interested in an abstract way. They asked questions about range and reliability and power consumption. Then they went back to their offices and continued planning for battleship modernization. The generals believed in guns, big guns, mounted on big ships, firing shells that could be seen and heard and felt. Radar was a curiosity, a laboratory toy, something that might matter someday, but not now. Not when budgets were tight and the fleet needed armor plate and 14-inch turrets. Page kept working. By 1939, his team had made substantial progress. The XAF radar, installed experimentally on the battleship USS New York, could track aircraft at over 100 miles. By 1940, the CXAM model was ready for production. It was mounted on the carrier USS Yorktown and began providing early warning in fleet exercises. The pilots loved it. They could be vectored to intercept incoming threats they never would have seen without radar warning. The surface gunnery community remained skeptical. Then came Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, radar mattered. Suddenly, every ship needed it. Suddenly, production lines that did not exist had to be built from nothing, and technicians who had never seen a cathode ray tube had to learn how to operate equipment that their commanders barely understood. The SG Surface Search Radar, Page's latest creation, was rushed into production in early 1942. It was compact enough to fit on a destroyer, powerful enough to track surface ships at night, sophisticated enough to distinguish between different types of contacts. The hardware went to sea in unprecedented numbers. The doctrine stayed on shore. Harold Van Acker was a different kind of man. An officer, not a scientist. A practical problem solver who had spent years thinking about how to make American guns hit targets in conditions where rangefinders failed. In the war games before the war, Van Acker had seen the weakness. Night engagements were a disaster. Smoke obscured visibility. Searchlights gave away your position. The whole system depended on conditions that combat rarely provided. What Van Acker wanted was a way to aim the guns without seeing the target. Radar could do that. But by the time a radar bearing was converted to a firing solution, the target had moved. Van Acker's solution was simple, obvious, and completely forbidden. Connect the radar directly to the fire control computer. Feed the Bureau of Ordnance said no. The connection was unauthorized. The interfaces were not approved. The liability, if something went wrong, would fall on whoever made the modification. Van Acker found officers who did not care about liability. The first ships to receive the modification were destroyers, small ships, junior officers in command, men who had seen what happened at Savo Island and Cape Esperance, men who understood that waiting for visual contact was waiting to die. They called it the Radar Fire Control Solution. It was all without anyone looking through a rangefinder. All with the gun and the November the first rear the intent. Callahan knew they were coming. Callahan was ready to fight. But Callahan was a surface warfare officer of the old school, a brave man. He had won the Navy Cross. He had served with distinction. He was not afraid to die. But he was also a man who trusted what he had learned at the Naval Academy in 1911, who believed in the visual traditions of naval gunnery, who had never fully accepted the green ghosts on the radar screen. His flagship, the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco, had an SG radar, one of the best in the fleet. The operators were tracking the Japanese force clearly, calling out bearings and ranges with increasing urgency. 2 columns of ships, range decreasing rapidly, bearing almost directly ahead, closing speed over 40 knots. The contact was unambiguous. The enemy was there. The enemy was coming. Callahan did not look at the radar plot. Instead, he focused on maneuvering his column, on positioning his ships for a gun engagement, on the traditional calculus of crossing the T and bringing maximum firepower to bear. He gave orders to prepare for a surface engagement. He ordered his destroyers into the lead, where they could launch torpedoes when the enemy came into view. He kept his cruisers in a tight column, ready to unmask their broadsides. The radar showed the Japanese splitting, moving to envelop the American formation from both sides. Nobody told Callahan in terms he understood. The radar operators were reporting in technical language, bearings, ranges, pip counts, but the information was not translating into tactical awareness. There was no plot, no clear picture, no one on the flag bridge who could synthesize what the radar was showing into something an admiral trained in optical warfare could absorb. At 0142, the van destroyer Cushing reported visual contact. Callahan still hesitated. There was confusion about identification. Were those contacts Japanese or American destroyers that had gotten out of position? Where exactly was the enemy formation? At 0148, the range closed to under 3,000 yards, less than 2 miles. The Japanese opened fire. Searchlights blazed across the water. Shells began striking the American ships before they could reply. Long Lance torpedoes, launched minutes earlier, were already running through the formation. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre conducted at knife range. San Francisco was struck repeatedly by 8-inch shells from the battleship Hiei. Admiral Callahan was killed. So was Captain Casson Young, who had survived Pearl Harbor and received the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. So was nearly every man on the bridge. The cruiser Atlanta, leading the formation, took a Long Lance torpedo amidships. The explosion broke her keel. Then she was hit by over 50 shells, some of them from the San Francisco, which had lost track of friend and foe in the chaos. Admiral Norman Scott, commanding the lead group from aboard Atlanta, died in the first minutes of the battle. The destroyers Cushing and Laffey fought at point-blank range, their crews firing at searchlights and muzzle flashes, scoring hits but taking terrible damage in return. Both ships were reduced to burning hulks. Both went down before dawn. Barton took a Long Lance almost immediately. She broke apart and sank in minutes. Only a handful of her crew survived. Monson was illuminated by Japanese searchlights and torn apart by concentrated gunfire. 37 rounds struck her before she could withdraw. In 34 minutes, the American force was shattered. 2 admirals dead, 2 cruisers sinking, 4 destroyers gone or dying, over 600 men killed in action, hundreds more wounded or struggling in oil-covered water. The Japanese lost 2 ships, the destroyer Akatsuki, sunk by American gunfire, and the battleship Hiei, so badly damaged that she could not withdraw before dawn. But the cost was catastrophic. The Americans had radar, they had warning, they had technical superiority, and they had lost because the technology was not connected to the decisions. But something unexpected also happened that night. On the destroyer USS O'Bannon, a young gunnery officer had made the connection. Not officially, not with paperwork. He had simply run the cable, trained with his crew, and waited for the moment when doctrine would fail. When the battle began, the O'Bannon opened fire almost immediately, not at muzzle flashes, not at searchlight beams, but at radar targets. Her guns tracked the bearing automatically. Her fire control computer calculated the solution. Her 5-inch shells struck a Japanese destroyer before the enemy knew they were being targeted. O'Bannon survived the battle. She was one of the few American ships to emerge without crippling damage. And in the after-action reports, buried among the pages of disaster, someone noticed. The ships with radar-directed fire had performed differently. Not perfectly. The battle was too chaotic, too close, too brutal for any system to function cleanly. But there was a pattern. The ships that had connected their radars to their fire control systems had hit targets faster. They had wasted fewer salvos. They had, in the mathematics of naval gunnery, achieved something close to impossible. They had won the first salvo in the dark. This should have changed everything immediately. It did not. The Navy was bureaucracy at war. Reports went up the chain, committees reviewed the data, officers argued about sample size and statistical significance and whether the results could be attributed to crew quality rather than equipment. Meanwhile, the killing continued. November 14th and 15th, the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The battleship Hiei, damaged in the first engagement, was caught by American aircraft and sunk. But that night, Japanese cruisers closed to within 2 miles of Henderson Field and shelled the airstrip with nearly 1,000 rounds. The Tokyo Express kept running. The Americans kept losing ships. And in radar rooms across the fleet, young officers kept asking the same question. Why are we waiting to see something we can already detect? Change came not from admirals. It came from the men who had to fight. By early 1943, the unofficial cable had become an open secret. Destroyer skippers talked. Cruiser gunnery officers compared notes. The word spread through the wardrooms. If you want to survive at night, connect the radar. The Bureau of Ordnance was still hostile. The modification invalidated warranties. It created maintenance problems. It ran against decades of procedure. But procedure was losing the war. In March 1943, the Navy finally issued a directive. Radar data could be used for initial fire control in conditions of poor visibility. The connection was no longer unauthorized. It was not exactly an endorsement. It was permission, grudging, and hedged with qualifications. But it was enough. Sir. The difference became clear in the battles that followed. July 6, 1943, the Battle of Kula Gulf. An American force under Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth, 3 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, intercepted a Japanese destroyer force running the Tokyo Express. 10 Japanese destroyers carrying troops and supplies for Vila on Kolombangara. Ainsworth had radar. His flagship, the light cruiser Honolulu, was equipped with the latest SG set, and his gunnery officer had made the connection. The Americans detected the Japanese at over 12 miles. Range and bearing fed automatically to the fire control computers. The guns tracked invisible targets across the black water. At 01:57, Ainsworth gave the order. The first American salvos struck the destroyer Nizuki before her lookouts had seen anything at all. Admiral Teruo Akiyama, commanding the Japanese force from aboard her, died before he could issue his first order. The Japanese were stunned. For over a year, they had owned the night. Their entire tactical doctrine depended on surprise, on closing to visual range before the Americans could react, on launching torpedoes from beyond where they could be seen. Now the Americans were shooting accurately at 12 miles in total darkness. Shells were striking ships that had not yet glimpsed their attackers. The mathematical certainty of Japanese night-fighting superiority was dissolving. Nizuki sank. Nagatsuki ran aground while maneuvering and was destroyed by aircraft the next morning. The Tokyo Express was disrupted. The supplies never reached the beach. The Japanese did launch torpedoes. They still had the Long Lance. The cruiser Helena was hit by 3 of them and sank with heavy loss of life. The night was not costless. But the pattern had shifted. The Americans had opened fire first. They had hit first. They had, for the first time, taken the initiative in a night surface action against a prepared enemy. August 6, 1943, the Battle of Vela Gulf. This time, the Americans were ready. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger led 6 destroyers into the slot, the channel between the Solomon Islands that the Tokyo Express used as a highway. Intelligence said 4 Japanese destroyers were coming, carrying troops and supplies for Kolombangara. Moosbrugger planned a coordinated ambush. His force would split into 2 divisions. One would attack with guns as the Japanese approached. The other would swing wide, approach on the flank, and launch torpedoes. Radar made the timing possible. At 23:33, the American radar operators detected the Japanese at 18,000 yards, 9 miles. The enemy had no idea they had been seen. Moosbrugger maneuvered his forces with surgical precision. Division B swung west, positioning for a torpedo attack. Division A closed from the east, guns trained on the oncoming Japanese. At 23:41, Division B launched torpedoes. 24 Mark 15 torpedoes, racing toward targets that still had not seen their attackers. At 23:43, the first torpedo struck the destroyer Arashi, then Kawakaze, then Hagikaze. The night erupted in flames. Division A opened fire immediately, catching the burning ships in a crossfire. The Japanese had no time to react. Their return fire was scattered, ineffective, blindly aimed at muzzle flashes they could barely see. Arashi sank. Kawakazi sank. Hagikaze sank. Over 1,500 Japanese sailors died, most of them in the water, illuminated by the flames of their own ships, unable to reach rescue. The fourth Japanese destroyer, Shigure, fled. She launched torpedoes that missed. She took no hits. She was the sole survivor. The Americans lost nothing. It was a massacre, and it was the direct result of that unauthorized cable, that forbidden connection, that decision by junior officers to trust the green dots on the screen. The evolution accelerated after Vella Gulf. The Combat Information Center, the CIC, emerged as the nervous system of American warships. It was not a single invention, but an organizational revolution, a new way of integrating information that changed the fundamental nature of naval command. Before the CIC, information on a warship was scattered. The radar operator sat in one compartment. The fire control officer sat in another. The lookouts reported to the bridge. The sonar team worked in isolation. Each piece of the puzzle existed separately, connected only by voice tubes and telephone circuits, and the limited bandwidth of human communication. The captain stood on the bridge, trying to assemble a coherent picture from fragments shouted through speaking tubes. The CIC changed everything. It was a dedicated compartment, typically located near the center of the ship, protected by armor when possible, where every source of information came together. Radar screens, plotting tables, communications circuits, status boards, and trained personnel, whose only job was to synthesize data from every sensor aboard and present it as a coherent tactical picture. The radar operator no longer just reported blips. He identified contacts, tracked their movement, estimated their composition. A sailor at the plot translated that information into marks on a transparent board, creating a real-time map of the battle space. The gunnery officer could look at that plot and see exactly where the enemy was, where friendly ships were positioned, how the tactical geometry was developing. He could feed targeting data directly to weapons systems without waiting for visual confirmation that might never come. The captain no longer stared into darkness. He looked at a picture assembled from electronic eyes that could see what humans could not. The ships that had fought at Savo Island in 1942 were not fundamentally different from the ships that fought at Surigao Strait in 1944. Same hulls, same guns, same engineering plants. If you had walked through them blindfolded, you might not have known the difference. But the ships at Surigao had CICs. They had radar fire control integrated into every aspect of the gunnery solution. They had officers trained to trust the plot, not the eyeball. They had procedures developed through 2 years of bloody trial and error in the waters around Guadalcanal. And at Surigao Strait, in the last battleship action in history, that evolution reached its culmination. October 25, 1944, the Battle of Surigao Strait. A Japanese surface force, 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers, steamed through the narrow waters of the Philippines, heading for the American landing beaches at Leyte. Waiting for them was the most complete naval ambush in modern history. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded the American force, 6 old battleships, most of them resurrected from the mud of Pearl Harbor, plus 8 cruisers and a swarm of destroyers and PT boats. The Japanese would have to transit the entire length of the strait under fire. The American radar tracked the Japanese from the moment they entered the strait. Range data flowed to fire control computers. Guns trained on targets that were invisible over the horizon. At 03:53, the battleships opened fire. The range was over 21,000 yards. The time was 3:53 in the morning. The darkness was absolute. No Japanese lookout could have seen the American battle line. But the radar saw the Japanese. The 14-inch and 16-inch shells fell on the battleship Yamashiro with devastating accuracy. Hit after hit. She burned. She slowed. She absorbed punishment that no ship could survive. At 04:19, Yamashiro rolled over and sank. Her sister ship Fuso, already broken in half by torpedo hits from American destroyers, burned until after dawn. The Japanese cruiser Mogami was shattered by cruiser gunfire. The destroyers were hunted down and sunk or driven off. The American battleships expended over 400 armor-piercing shells. The range at which they opened fire, 14 miles in total darkness, would have been unimaginable at Savo Island. But the men at Surigao had something the men at Savo did not. The cable, the connection, the CIC, the trust. 87 Japanese ships would ultimately be sunk in actions where radar fire control played a decisive role. Surigao was only the most dramatic example. The unauthorized cable had become standard equipment. The revolution was complete. Yeah. Robert Page lived to see all of it. He survived the war. He continued his work at the Naval Research Laboratory. He saw radar evolve from experimental apparatus to ubiquitous technology, spreading into anti-aircraft systems, missile guidance, air traffic control, weather prediction. He rarely spoke about the resistance. In interviews years later, Page was careful, diplomatic, scientific. He understood why the old officers had doubted. They were not stupid men. They were trained men, conditioned by experience to distrust what they could not verify. But he also understood what that distrust had cost. At Savo Island, at Guadalcanal, in all the night actions where American sailors died, waiting for visual confirmation of something the radar had shown them 10 minutes earlier. Page knew the weight of those minutes. Harold Van Acker is less remembered now. His contribution was not invention. It was connection, integration, making two systems talk to each other in defiance of institutional boundaries. He was not the only one. Across the fleet, junior officers and chief petty officers and radar technicians made similar choices. They ran cables. They improvised interfaces. They solved problems that the bureaucracy could not solve, because the bureaucracy was not standing on a deck, watching torpedo wakes approach at 40 knots. They broke the rules because the rules were wrong. And in breaking the rules, they changed the nature of naval combat forever. Ooh. There is a phrase that military historians use, the fog of war. It refers to the confusion, the uncertainty, the gap between what commanders think is happening and what is actually happening. Fog of war has decided more battles than brilliant tactics. Radar was a fog-clearing machine. It did not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduced it. It gave commanders information that was unavailable to every admiral in history before 1940. Range, bearing, closing speed, number of contacts. The old admirals did not trust it because they had never had anything like it. They demanded visual confirmation because visual confirmation was the only confirmation their experience recognized. Their caution was understandable. Their caution was also fatal. The lesson of the unauthorized cable is not simply about technology. It is about the gap between what institutions know and what they are willing to accept. The Navy had the radar. The Navy had the fire control computers. The Navy had, by 1942, all the hardware necessary to dominate night combat. What the Navy lacked was permission. Permission to trust the new system. Permission to abandon the old doctrine. Permission to let young officers connect machines in ways that violated procedure manuals. That permission came from below. It came from men who had seen their ships burn and their friends die, and their commanders fail to use the tools they already possessed. It came from enlisted radar technicians who knew the SG set could track a destroyer at 15 miles. It came from gunnery officers who knew the Mark 37 computer could calculate a firing solution faster than any human. It came from chiefs and lieutenants who understood that doctrine exists to serve combat, not the other way around. They ran the cable. They took the risk. They broke the rules. And they changed the Pacific War. Today, nearly every weapon system in every navy in the world relies on principles that those junior officers pioneered. Radar is no longer controversial. Fire control is no longer dependent on optical instruments. The CIC is no longer a radical concept. Modern warships are built around the assumption that sensors and weapons must be integrated, that data must flow automatically, that human judgment matters, but human eyesight does not. All of this traces back to the men who looked at a cathode ray tube in 1942 and decided to trust what they saw. The bureaucracy said no. The battles said yes. The bureaucracy eventually agreed. But the agreement came after the blood had already been spent. There is a memorial at Iron Bottom Sound. It is called that because so many ships rest on the bottom. American, Japanese, Australian. The water is deep there. The wrecks are silent. Among them lie the cruisers and destroyers of November 1942. The men who died waiting for visual confirmation. The men whose radar showed the enemy clearly, whose operators called out bearings and ranges, whose information went up the chain and stopped somewhere short of action. They are still there. The admirals who ignored the screens are gone. The doctrines they defended are forgotten. The regulations they enforced are historical curiosities. But in every guided missile, in every drone, in every targeting system that acquires a threat beyond the range of human vision, If you have watched this far, you already know why these stories matter. Wars are... The men who connected the radar to the guns understood that before anyone else. They did not wait for approval. They did not wait for the system to catch up. They made the connection themselves. This channel exists to tell stories like theirs. If you want more, subscribe. Share this with someone who cares about forgotten history. The machines do not remember. We have to.